Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at the conquest of the West, the westward expansion across the United States. Now, this is a process that definitely began as soon as the Revolutionary War ended in the late 18th century, but throughout the 19th century, it really goes into full speed. So let's take a look at some of those motivators, impacts, and what happened when the people who lived here prior to this expansion interacted with those people who are now moving westward. This picture has a lot going on in it that you can probably see. You've got the angel in the foreground. You've got people heading left. If you think of your compass rose, that would be heading west. You've got Native Americans running at the edge of the shadow. You have darkness that is becoming light. You have technology. You have trains and telegrams, and the book the angel is holding that might be knowledge, that might be the Bible. It is all up to interpretation. There's so much going on in this picture. So let's dive into the content and see what we see. Our first big rush for people to move, and our first big motivator, was gold. And in 1849 in Sutter's Mill in California, gold is discovered in rather large numbers. So many people from all over the world are going to start heading here to Sutter's Mill expecting to get rich. And gold is a fantastically rare, extremely valuable resource. It trades for $1,000, $2,000 per ounce. So the fact that you could just pluck it out of the water was really exciting. There's a couple of different ways that people would mine this gold. There's placer mining, that's prospector mining, the guy who has the little pan in the river. There's quartz mining, where you dig deep and you find, well, like this piece of quartz here, quartz that has denser metals running through it, and that denser metal would be gold. You've got hydraulic mining, which is where you use fire hose type pressure to blast away the side of a hill, the side of a cliff, the size of a mountain, and then you can get the denser metals. Now this is really fast, but as you can imagine, has terrible, catastrophically bad ecologic reactions to it. After the Civil War, we see that the West had lots of cities that were burgeoning and growing. Cities like San Francisco or Denver, Salt Lake City, or San Antonio here in Texas. Cities that had populations of 250,000 and more. These cities were definitely on the frontier. They were agriculture towns, boom towns, but they were also industrial towns. This was where things were being made as well as stuff being grown. If you lived in this time, there was no Better Business Bureau. There was no price checking. So if you want to gouge your prices and make someone pay significantly more, you can do that. If you've been run off your land, run off your claim, you might decide to salt the earth, and that's a literal thing. You sow salt into the ground so nothing will grow there ever again. Virginia City was a boom town for silver specifically, and you had saloons operating, and 25 different saloons in operation before it had 4,000 people. Now, this isn't because, it was Nevada and ooh, party time. It's because the drinking of alcohol was in some cases safer than the drinking of the water. Fermentation can kill off a lot of those bad bacteriums. By the mid-1850s, we're seeing lots and lots and lots of Chinese immigration arriving on the West Coast, about 4,000 to 5,000 every year. And by the Burlingame Treaty of 1868, that number is going to double. These people came here looking to escape how bad things were going in China, and they were really bad there, just like how people left Ireland or Luxembourg or Slovenia. In Europe, people are leaving China, Laos, Cambodia for exactly the same reasons. They came here, they were cheap labor, and that was that at first. But as more and more of those railroads were done, they started competing in other fields, and this meant that they were competing with white labor as well. There was some real fear that the Chinese were going to take over, and this was such a pronounced fear that in 1879 the state of California passed a constitutional law that said they could not vote, and from 1882 they were not even allowed to show up. But this is kind of surprising because in California there were lots of people who were not born in America who were living there. A third of all Californians at this time were born somewhere else. 40% of Nevadans came from somewhere else, Idaho and Arizona. Half those populations were first generation individuals. If you're living on the Great Plains, the center states, life was sold to you as come out here and farm. It's great, it's flat, the earth is rich, and in all those areas you are very correct, but there's a lot of problems that also were not in those travel, come here, set up a new life brochures. The first one is there's a real lack of water. You need to dig deep to get to some wells. The area is flat. Geographically, Kansas is flatter than a pancake. But that means if you want to build stuff, there's not trees, there's not stones. So unless you want to quarry all your rocks, your first home might be made out of sod, out of dirt, and that's what that house in the background is there. The summers are very hot. The winters are very cold. There are terrible prairie fires because everything is grass. And the wind in the autumn and fall can howl all day long. And you've got the Native Americans. You know, the people whose land it was before anyone else showed up. If we look at our Plains Native Americans, and in this lecture they're referenced as Native Americans, as founding people, as first people, and as Indians. This is just the different terms that these groups have been used over time. Generally, we see that there's some uniform cultures across the Plains groups. They hunted the bison. It was one of their principal animals. In some tribes, it was deity. It was food. It is shelter. You can light the poop on fire and you can burn it if you need to. And these peoples really adapted very quickly to European stuff and even Western Americaner stuff. Metal weapons, metal tools, decorations, cloth. Now, buffaloes were a big animal for the Native Americans. The next big animal was the horse. During the last great ice age, the horse was dead. The horse did not survive the last great ice age in the Americas. The entire species was gone. So when the Spanish brought these horses with them, it became a vital part of culture. It became a vital part of Native American lifestyle. You could hunt better with it. You could move better with it. It was effective in everything. And it transformed Native American lifestyle. As more and more people are moving west, the question came with what do we do with the Native Americans? And the federal government tried a lot of different ideas. The first one to talk about was the idea of concentration. And this was the idea that instead of dealing with all tribes individually, you deal with all Native Americans as one unit, as like all Native Americans were part of a new country, for example. And the idea of that was you could treat us all Native Americans in one group and not think, well, we had this deal with this tribe and that deal with that tribe. That is one of those ideas that on paper, it even sounds bad on paper. In practice, it was even worse because that had never been the way these groups had ever operated. And that was not going to just magically happen now. This treaty was passed in 1851 at Fort Laramie, and this was headed by a guy named Thomas Fitzpatrick, who had a lot of experience with Native American groups. And because of who he was such a renowned individual amongst them and among the leaders of the different tribes in the area that 10,000 Native Americans attended this treaty. Now, the treaty said a lot of things. First off, it said if you looked at this map, and this map that is currently up here, that is the hunting grounds for Native Americans. They would each get different parts of this territory that they were allowed to hunt in whenever they wanted to. Secondly, they would be given gifts and payments and money from the federal government every year. And if there was any abandoned property, Native Americans could just, have it. This doesn't sound too terrible until it all fell apart. The promises were broken almost immediately. The presents that were supposed to show up didn't. And pressure from different groups were really confounded when we see people continuing to move out there. When Kansas and Nebraska went from being territories to states, the Native Americans there were kind of just left as, well, we were promised this land, and then it disappeared. Land that had been promised in Colorado disappeared when there was gold discovered there. That's not the last time that happens. During the Civil War years, Native Americans really didn't fight on one side or another. They viewed that, the white people were fighting amongst themselves, so now is a good time for us to fight each of them. So they fought both sides. And this led to, for a while, both sides being resentful towards Native Americans. It escalated in 1864 at the Sand Creek Massacre, where the Colorado militia killed 450 Cheyenne. After the Civil War ended, the federal government decided that reservations were what was going to happen. They were going to put Native Americans on different reservations. And this map here shows where some of the early reservation plans were to be. And over the course of 2 years, the principal chiefs of the plains agreed to this. And a lot of Native Americans agreed with this because there was not a third option. But some still wanted to fight. And Native Americans were really great guerrilla fighters, especially prior to the late 1870s, when reloading a gun might take you 60 seconds or more. They were fast on horses, they knew how to fight, they knew how to find people, and, well, this was their land first, and they definitely had something to fight for. In 1869, Congress created the Board of Indian Commissioners, and that picture right there, those 6 people were the first Indian commissioners. Those 6 people were given the task to, quote, oversee Native American affairs. Now, that sounds like a giant task, a task that you can say, wow, I can't imagine. How many people? Wow, 6? Okay, how much money did they have? Never enough. Never enough resources, never enough people, never enough money. This was a system that it was a good idea, it just never got off the ground. In 1874, when gold was discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota, it was on a Sioux reservation. And miners, prospectors, hoping to get rich, just like what had happened in California and Colorado, pour into this area. And Native Americans are pushed out. They start concentrating around the Bighorn River in Montana. And in 1876, the fear was that these Native Americans were going to attack and rise up. So the U.S. Army sends troops in to Bighorn. And that would become the Battle of Little Bighorn. The man who was in charge of the 7th Cavalry, George Custer, is decorated. He is a Civil War vet. He had graduated from West Point. And he has about 700 soldiers and a couple of Gatling guns with him. So he has lots of people and lots of tech. And when his scouts come back and tell him, we cannot attack here. These are Native American scouts who come back and say, there are 2,500 Sioux warriors down there. There's only 700 cavalry here. Those numbers alone would be enough that you would want to think, no. But Custer decided to attack anyway. He felt that the scouts had miscounted and his two big Gatling guns were going to be more than enough to take victory. And boy howdy was he wrong. The thing that ultimately helped end the Indian Wars faster than anybody expected was the railroad. Now, as we had talked about in the Gilded Age video, when the federal government gave railroad companies land, they gave them land to make sure the trains could keep going. And one of the things that might impede the trains from going is a buffalo. If you are in a train and you're going 50 miles an hour and there's a herd of 1,000 buffalo in front of you, 100 buffalo in front of you even, if you're going at full speed and you hit that herd, it will derail your train and everyone on board dies. Even stopping the train, it's not like stopping your car where you can go from 60 to 0 in, a couple hundred feet. Railroad companies viewed the buffalo as a nuisance to railroads. So the railroad companies hired hunters to go out and kill buffalo. And you could make, if you were a hunter, a quarter for every buffalo head you bring in. And this is back in a time where for a quarter, that might be a week groceries. And all you have to do is bring in one buffalo head. And it's a buffalo. It's not like it's a bear. They're cows. So it was real easy hunting these things. And they were hunted to near extinction. And that became the thing that helped speed up the end of the Indian Wars. Because this animal was the cornerstone of Native American food, culture, society, everything, and now it is gone. The first groups that started giving up after this were those groups in the tribes and in the deserts. Well, actually, they were the last ones too. Sorry about that. The Apaches were some of the last to keep the fight going until their principal chief, Geronimo, was captured. And after that, the idea of how are we going to make this not a problem anymore is to, quote unquote, civilize Native Americans. And that's a picture of a group of young men who were Native American descent, who were brought to a school and taught, this is how you're going to be now. You're going to dress like this. You're not going to dress in your traditional clothing anymore. You're not going to speak your traditional language anymore. You're not going to worship your traditional gods anymore. You are going to do it our way, the white way. And if you don't like it, then, well, there's not another option. This is it. And that was the idea. And it's horrible, and it worked more than it should have. Tribal lands didn't exist anymore. The Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 took all the land that a tribe had and divided it up so each family had their own part of tribal land. That land belonged to that family for the next 2.5 decades. If that land is given to you, you have to live on it. You cannot act like a tribe anymore. And if you work it for the next 2.5 decades and live a quote-unquote civilized life, which at this point meant act like a white person, then you were granted U.S. citizenship. However, it didn't work. Well, it didn't work as well as the feds thought it would. The thought was that Native Americans would become small-scale farmers. They would like the idea of making money and adopt the civilized way of life. And it didn't work, because if anything, it just made lots of Native Americans rally around the idea that all we have left is this little bit of land and each other. Local authorities would tax Native American lands more. Once that 25-year gap had ended, there were people who went in to trick Native Americans to buying and selling that land. And this image right here really shows the land that was transferred from one group to the next from the last 150 years. Reflecting back on wealth of gold and silver, our most successful mineral strike came in 1859 at Comstock Lode in Nevada. There was a lot of money that was made out of this silver mine, and so much silver was mined so quickly, Nevada becomes known as the Silver State, and it's kind of fast-tracked to statehood so that, it could be taxed. And mineral wealth, you can get real rich if you can get that, load of cash. But there's also agricultural wealth, farming wealth. And once you finish mining all the gold and all the silver, the land is still land. And very quickly, lots of people learned that, and they decided to do something with the land itself. The Homestead Act of 1862 said if you wanted land in the West, it was yours. That was it. You had to apply for it. You could get 160 acres of land very easily. And here's the best part of it, it was usually free. If you were a small farmer, or if you were landless poor living in the United States, the idea of 160 acres of land was really exciting. I mean, an acre of land now can be, depending on where you're living, well over $200,000. So 160 times that for free, cha-ching. Unfortunately, it wasn't just the average person who's looking to start a farm that does this. Big businesses and giant corporate farms started appearing too. And these are going to be known as bonanza farms, where you have huge tracts of land that belong to, in some cases, very few numbers of people or very few private entities. What's great if you're owning this bonanza farm is you can produce lots of food, and when you're doing so, you can buy your supplies wholesale and you can sell stuff for at cost. It's kind of like going to Sam's. You can buy the stuff cheaper there because you're buying in bulk. If I'm buying for 160 acres of seed versus I'm buying the seed for 1,600 acres, my seed guy might be willing to cut me a deal. Unfortunately, most of these are going to collapse in the 1880s after a series of very bad droughts. But even still, the Plains states are going to become the breadbasket of the Americas. It's not just agricultural wealth, it's also cattle too. By the late 18th century, we see that the cattle that was here, specifically Texas, was being crafted into something else. Spanish ranchers brought certain cows with them, and after some breeding of local cattle with Spanish cattle, they created some Texas cattle, the most successful of which was the Texas Longhorn. And this thing was successful because you could raise it really cheap and sell it for really a lot. The biggest cost was getting it from one place to the next, and for that you had to walk your cattle. And that might mean you're following one of these cattle trails here up to slaughter. Now, if you're a cowboy and you've got 500 cows that you're trying to take up the Chisholm Trail, you're going to need a lot of stuff. I mean, you need food and water and supplies for you and anyone who's with you, but your animals also need food and water. And if you're walking from, let's say, Fort Worth up to Wichita, and you come across a river and your animals haven't had anything to drink for a day or two, they're going to drink. But what happens when that land belongs to somebody else? That somebody else might not be happy for this. But it's the open range, you know, there's no borders, there's no nothing, you say. That all came to an end with barbed wire. This fencing, produced by Joseph Glidden, the same Glidden as the paint Glidden, was a real simple twisting of wire that was simple to make, cheap to sell, easy to set up. And farmers started using this as their perimeter of their fence line and perimeter of their property lines by the end of the 19th century. And with this now up, that was it. That was the end of the open range. The West would continue to be this growing thing in a frontier place, and many American historians look back at this time and say that the frontier component of the United States is one of the things that made the United States what it would become. So, today we took a look at westward expansion, interaction with native groups, and cattle. Hope you learned something today. I'll see you next time.